And now we'll welcome Dr. Jenny Hocking, who is Emeritus Professor at Monash University. Good to see you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Jocelynne, and hello, everyone.
Good. Yeah, it's Dr. Helen Pringle, Mary Kerr, and Kerry Heubel, and Bashi Kumar can't be here at the moment, but she's also on the panel. So are you happy to go ahead and make your statement?
Yes, look, I'll just speak briefly, Jocelynne, to some of the points that I raised with you. You know, in the context of some of the things that obviously you've been hearing, these are very specific to questions within the academy, but I also see them as very relevant to how we see in a more popular sense an understanding of women's contribution to history and women's recognition of women and women's scholarship in history. And I think the flow-on effects of that are more broad-ranging, if you like, than a simple concern for within the academy. And I do think it's a relevant factor for the things that the CEDAW group is looking at today. Some of the things I've become particularly interested in, I suppose, as I get older in my academic work, is the way in which women are still, I think, very much underrepresented in some of the compilation volumes of what we present as our national history, some of the national biographical dictionaries, for example. And that's really a well-established fact. That's been something that's been pointed to around the world, a long-established disparity. For example, the American National Biography has only 14% of their entries on women. Dictionary of Canadian Biography is only 6%. New Zealand is 26%, which is, you know, really far and away the best one. And Australia, our own ADB, Australian Dictionary Biography, women make up 11% of the overall entries. But if you look at the colonial period going up to about, I think it's 1850, the figures are only 4%. And that's a starting point today because they're pretty stark figures. And there has been a lot of effort over the last, I'd say, 10 years under the editorship of Melanie Nolan to really redress that. But the way in which they're addressing it highlights just how difficult it is to pull out of such a stark disparity. They've added 1,500 new entries on women in the colonial period, but that still barely touches the surface, really. There's a missing person supplementary edition of which not even more than half were actually women, and I would have thought most of those missing persons might actually be women. And there's another group called Just Missed Out, but still the disparity remains. But nevertheless, there is an effort. There's certainly a recognition of it, and there's an effort to redress it. And I think if you look at some of the recent compilations that have been made specifically about women, that's really highlighted just how, I mean, to me, it's almost unbelievable that so many women that I've come across in my rather rudimentary colonial historical research are just not there in the ADB. I'll give you one example is of a woman who came out with her convict husband. She developed the business. She was a business leader. She's there in all of the colonial records, not hard to find. And yet in the ADB, you see both her husbands, all her male children, some of her male grandchildren, and no entry for her. So it does persist. And you see with something like Professor Kim Rubinstein's wonderful compilation, Trailblazing Women Lawyers, for example, just how vast the gulf is between women as historical actors and their presence in some of these national repositories. And so I wanted to draw that to your attention as something that's been acknowledged and recognised, but that also some headway is being made in, because I want to come back to that when I might mention what I think is some of the concrete steps that can be taken to redress some of these things. The thing that's interesting about, for example, the ADB, and I am thinking about writing a piece about this, is that even though there's been a recognition of undoubted gender disparity there, it tends to focus on the subjects, the entries. Why aren't there more women? But I'd like to ask, why aren't there more women writers for the ADB? You know, there's a whole other side to that, which gets to the point of women's scholarship. And is women's scholarship being recognised? Are women being recognised as experts in this field? and I'm sure every academic like me could point you to personal examples of where that has not been the case, and I won't, it's not about personal experiences, but it is a pattern of behaviour of which the ADB entries, I think, reflect very clearly. But also it's interesting that hasn't been a focus of the redress. The redress has seemed to be one that focuses only on subjects. And yet if you look at who has written about the key historical figures, and of course in Australia they've tended to be, of course, the Prime Ministers, well, with an exception of Julia Gillard, they have been male, Chief Justices, High Court judges and Governors General and so on. And remembering the ADB at the moment is only up to about the early 1960s, 1970s, just beginning. So if you look back, I just did a rudimentary check through the early prime ministerial entries, which we've had about 16, say up to 1967 with Harold Holt. Only 3 of them have been written by women. So there's another countervailing disparity in who is seen as a scholarship generator and a scholarship holder in terms of gender, and that's very much skewed, and yet that's a side of it that has not been looked at. And I think that disparity in both the subjects and the authorship highlights, as I said, the invisibility of women as historical actors in our national story and our national identity that flows from that, and the disparity in the authorship highlights what's a broader concern about under-citation of women's scholarship and the lack of recognition of women's intellectual and historical contributions. And it's more so in certain academic fields and processes. And again, although it's been recognised, it is changing. And I think, again, the fact that it's changing and improving in some quarters does point you again to how things can improve even further. But if we look at the broader question again, why is this now well-documented imbalance in citations continuing? One staggering citation disparity from only last year is in the sciences, and that, of course, is where it's worse. My own example is from the social sciences, but, for example, in the National Academy of Sciences, men had on average about 14,000 more citations in their lifetime as scholars than women. Now, that is absolutely staggering. And the significance of under-citation, by which I mean the failure to adequately source the work of women, the scholarship of women, and even the direct findings of women, where only that woman could have found that and has, in fact, generated the original research. The failure to citation leads to all sorts of issues further down the track. A lack of promotion because there isn't the citation reckoning that is part of that process. There isn't the impact factor, as it's called, where you look at what your impact is on the academy more broadly. It has a raft of impacts, including on grant application, because you're asked to cite your impact factor and your citation index as well. So those are, again, they may appear to be small issues, but they can develop further within the academic field in those terms around promotions and career path and so on. And I just want to, it was raised actually by Emeritus Professor Marilyn Lake in a recent article where she was reflecting on a failure to recognise some of the recent female scholarship around colonial times in response to a work that had come out last year. And so it is an ongoing issue. It's a recognised issue. What I think we need to be alert to is that women then developing their own histories and, filling that much needed gap at the same time runs the risk that women as historians become marginalised around those areas, leaving what is seen as a national history to those that want to continue to see it to the exclusion of women. And that's something I suppose in my own work I've tended to rail against. And I've looked at people who have been, male historical figures. And to me, it's important that women ought to be able to write about any form of history that they wish to and not feel that they're pigeonholed in that way. And it's only once we reach that point where there's not an expectation that this is a sort of bifurcated intellectual field, women's history and men's history. We are all part of a shared national scholarly endeavour, and I would hope that we're seen in that way. But there's also, I just wanted to point to a very important article that came out last year from 12 women in the environmental sciences who published a staggering paper in 2021. They published 34 books and 207 peer-reviewed pieces between them, and they pointed to the fact that over the previous 3 months, 4 of their members had been omitted from published work by male authors, or inadequately cited or entirely omitted. And they'd felt so strongly about this, they wrote a piece jointly, 12 of them, pointing to what they say is a larger pattern in all disciplines of the undercitation of scholarship by women and people of colour. And as they point out, as I said, it plays out in who gets grants, in grant applications, and extends to applied fields of scholarship outside the academy, including who's used as an expert or an expert witness, or who's asked to comment in the press, and so on. And it's now sufficiently acknowledged, I think, that notion of undercitation of women in particular, for it to be an area that's important as an area of further study in Australia, and I think it should be. How is that being looked at? Are women being excluded as scholars in areas that, provide an overview of the field, and yet that field tends to be a fairly narrow one. And finally, I just wanted to make a few points about publishing, because I think in terms of reviewing, this is another area where we have seen quite some improvement, and again, that might suggest ways in which this can be improved yet further, both here but also in other countries that might take some heart from that. One of the things that all authors will tell you is how important being able to gain a review in the major press outlets is. And the number of press outlets and possibilities for that has declined markedly in Australia in the last decade. We've seen the sort of synchronisation of the Fairfax papers. So instead of having 7 different state and territory papers, we've now really got one syndicated largely from Sydney. It reduces how many reviews there are possible, and there's long been a recognition that not only is it difficult, there's something like less than 10% chance of any one book getting a review in a major press outlet, which is quite staggering. But the really important thing is that the Stella Prize, which you've probably heard of, which is a prize established about 10 years ago, 2012, to give a national award for a female writer about a female subject. That is, I think, has really dramatically changed the public presentation of work by female scholars and historians and writers, and very dramatically so. But the other thing that Stella has done in recent years is do that counting of gender disparity in reviews. And this is absolutely critical, because it's drawn at home to editors and newspaper proprietors just how gender biased the gender and other a disparity has been up until recently in their reviewing practices. And they report that the commonest response is of surprise from the editors. Oh, we had no idea. So gathering the empirical data is absolutely vital. And by doing that, by being able to show newspaper editors and the literary editors that, they were only reviewing 10 years ago, about 30% of their books were by women. Now we're at parity, and even better than parity, which is quite an extraordinary shift in 10 years. I know that there's also the VITA count in America, which has been doing a very similar thing, but the last recorded gender count I saw from VITA was actually in 2019, so I'm not sure if it's still going. I think that the Stella count is actually now the longest running. It's 10 years. But they do make the point that even though 55% of books reviewed in 2020 were books by and about women, which is extraordinary, or sorry, books by women, they make the point that within that, there is still a big difference between placement, and this is really important in reviews. Where is your book review placed? Is it one of the early ones? Is it one of the shorter ones? What's the length of the review? Does it get a lead review, a long review, which are more often the longer reviews are still predominantly men. It's maybe 55-60% male, 40% women authors. So these are still things that are being unpacked. But I think the fact that there has been that positive shift, and there's a recognition of the need for change, both within publishing and reviewing, I think it gives some pointers for how that can be dealt with in other areas where it hasn't yet been addressed. And it seems to me that some of the critical things there, firstly, is to get an empirical base. Unless there is detail and data on the percentages, the numbers, to get the facts and figures to present to editors on who is being reviewed and by whom and for how long, change won't happen. That's had a big impact. And I think the second, and I've noticed this very markedly in editor collections, where, you know, a book that was published just this year, I was utterly shocked, as in an area that I'm familiar with, that out of about 22 authors that included in that editor collection, only 2 were women. I mean, in this 2023, I found that staggering. And this is a field where there's no dearth of women if you knew the first thing about it. So we're still not yet at the point where women's scholarship is regularly recognised. And, and I'm sure you've all grimaced when you see it, yet another conference panel made up of all men. I mean, really, those days should be over. And I think part of that issue is to accumulate the data, to call it out, and to recognise and encourage publishers to be aware of that, to be cognizant of that when they're putting together a collected, edited collection. How, you know, a huge percentage of the population has been omitted from the authorship here. And to encourage things like the Stella Prize and other Stella counts and so on to actually provide the data that can drive further research. I do think this is an area that in the Academy, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia is very interested in this, and I think that it does need to be something that is brought up there as well as a way of looking at it and redressing that into the future.
Oh, thanks so much, Jenny. That's really, really important. And it reminded me that there is a group of women in Australia who's working on Wikipedia to increase the number of women and the length of the entries for them there. But no, that's a wonderful contribution. Thank you. And let me hand over to our panellists here with questions.
Do you see many young women writing in this industry and publishing, or is it an issue with women getting published?
Look, it's probably both. I think in all areas there are disparities, and when you look at the way it's taken such a long time for women as authors to get where I feel they ought to be in terms of both a recognition and publishing outlets and review outlets, I think for young women that needs to be looked at as well. But I do think there are growing areas that recognise the need to try and be more broad in terms of who are the authors being approached, both as writers and reviewers. So again, I don't know the data on those sorts of on that specific question, and the only data I've seen on a gender breakdown I haven't seen ones that break down even further into age. And I think that's really important, because one thing that certainly the breakdown of the bare statistics, for example, on gender in reviewing, you need to go further than that, and go into the length of the articles, the placement of the review, and so on. So I agree with you totally. You do need to look then at an age disparity as well, both in terms of who gets whose books they are, but also in terms of who gets to review those books.
No? Any questions? Oh, well, look, can I go ahead? Because I wanted to say that the overlooking of women is extraordinary. And unfortunately, this is an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography that was, well, I won't say who it was written by, but actually it was written by a woman. And it's about Adele Pankhurst. And you see, I was doing a case, and I was looking at the Commonwealth Law Reports in 1919, and just for some case I was doing, and I came across 2 cases that involved Adele Pankhurst. I've written about this. Now, in one of them, it was Adele Pankhurst by herself. She was urging people to throw rocks in the shop windows in Footscray. And the other one, it was 3 women demonstrating at Parliament House about wheat going abroad and therefore the cost of bread going up during the war. And what this entry says is Adele Pankhurst, Jenny Haynes, and one other. Now, the one other was Alice Suter. And the reason I know that is because a patriarchal newspaper wrote the report from which I found the three women were Adele Pankhurst, Jenny Haynes, and Alice Suter, not one other. So ironically, it was the patriarchal record of the newspaper that had the accurate data. And I think we need as women and feminists to start recognising that sometimes women write women out of history and history, and that sometimes it's the official patriarchal record that actually has the truth. I find that really an interesting point.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right in the sense that really that's about doing the research, you know, and going back to first sources, because I found that incredibly with early colonial times is that to go back to even to the official, you know, Sydney Gazette, this particular woman I've been looking at, she is there all the time.
Yeah.
You know, and it's in the paper because she's, you know, it's a very highly regulated period. People who are doing things are noticed and documented. And yet she gets dropped from the history once the written history starts to take its shape. So yes, going back to the original sources, which in that case, as you say, is the original press coverage, is really, really important. But it's a bit like, you know, one recent book describing Jessie Street as the wife of a well-known judge. And that's it. So, you know, it is amazing how quickly that in particular works, those sort of erroneous descriptions just get swept up and become part of the national story. And yeah, and I guess all you could do is, you know, when you come across a specific instance, you know, write and let them know and hope that it's corrected. But yes, it's also about covering all bases in research.
That's right.
Helen. One of the things that I notice about the ADB is the whitewashing of men's entries. I'm kind of puzzled by that. Like, for example, you know, Qantas recently celebrated its centenary. Qantas was built on the back and by, I don't know any other word to call them other than bloodthirsty, savage bastards who cleared large areas of Queensland. And Hudson Fish, for example, is card holder number one. And, you know, and the sexual violence that these men perpetrated as well. So the things that they did to women also are completely left out of the ADB, you know, or they whitewash. They're sort of, like General McCain, for example, one of them, he had a mistress. And, you know, the mistress is kind of, turns out to be somebody who's actually quite prominent herself. And the kind of story is completely hidden. So that women's stories, you know, they're part of a whitewashing of the entries. So I don't know how to, you know, how you go about fixing that, but I mean, it was most striking to me with finding that out about Qantas through my own, through work that I myself had done, you know, and then thinking, why would you celebrate? Why would you celebrate these things? And so that women, when they do appear, don't appear truthfully.
I think
stories of men. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not involved with what goes into those sort of editorial decisions, and I've only recently written one piece myself for the ADB, but I do know that they're concerned to address some of those issues that have been pointed out, and that has been pointed out, not in that specific instance, but in a general sense, that the nature of the early colonial entries is really very, very partial and not at all. You know, you couldn't say it's representative in any way. So, and I think there's a full acknowledgement of that in terms of the new if you like, catch-up additions that they're putting together at the moment. But it's an absolutely, it's a sort of fraught exercise there to try, because they're always writing back. They don't start preparing entries until someone has actually died. And so they're always playing sort of catch up with a period that's already long gone. But I think the big issue is how people are selected for entry as well. And as you say, how to make that entry comprehensive, even if it covers things that people obviously have not wanted to put out there. And that's a bigger question, I think, because it would involve actually rewriting original entries, because I think that would be a very, very common, unfortunately, a very common experience of those early entries.
That's where the Americans have been more honest, when they actually acknowledge that the founders of America as a republic were slave owners. And Thomas Jefferson has been, a film's been made about him to tell at least part of the truth. George Washington too, they all owned slaves. And that the Capitol, that beautiful building, was built by slaves. I mean, but they do at least come to grips and acknowledge that. And maybe with this, the $5 billion or whatever it was that was given to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra at Russell, maybe now that there's been an explicit decision that it will actually report on the Aboriginal wars, the wars that were fought when this country was invaded, that may be somewhat of a turning point in terms of at least some acknowledgement of the reality of this country's history. And then the herstory too needs to be included in that. The women who fought and were never recognised and who were refused access to housing that went to men who were returned from the war because they'd been refused the right to go into the war zone.
Well, and also the women who worked, the land army women and
yes,
and the women in factories and women in industry in general taking over jobs that otherwise were denied to them and then having to leave them again once the war was over. That's a whole group of women that might have not have gone physically over to the front line, but were here doing things that otherwise couldn't have been done and continued and wanted to continue in them, but couldn't afterwards. So that's another side of that hasn't really received the prominence, I think, understandably, I suppose, of the frontier wars, which you're right, it does sound like that will now be certainly far more acknowledged in the War Memorial, but what a long time it's taken to have that recognised at that level, which it ought to have been. Really, I just think that's quite extraordinary that it has taken that long.
But even in frontier wars, it's called the frontier wars, and we have ideas of people being killed, that we call them the Myall Creek Massacre, not the Myall Creek rapes, not the Myall Creek sexual violence. We should call it the Myall Creek Massacre, but it is, there's a woman, at least one woman, and probably more, raped at that time, and nobody was ever held responsible or hanged for the rape. Nobody. And the pattern of sexual violence across Australia was just extraordinary. And people like Macquarie, they have a statue down in women's statuary is another kind of historical memory. At our university, we have. I did a survey of the statuary here. There's only one statue of a figurative statue of a woman, and that's of a nymph flying beside a bull. Whereas the main statuary place, which is outside the library, there are three men, all of whom I probably deserve to be there: Mandela, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. No women. And that form of historical commemoration in non-written forms is also something that we need.
And where there is a woman, it's a queen, an ex or a current,
or a nymph.
Yes.
Yeah. Nymphs are very, like in what's his name for the prize, the Archibald Prize, the fountain that he commissioned. It's very beautiful, I know, but you know, it's musicals. Oh, never women, never. And I know, and then most people now, we're even going to miss out again because most people now say things like, I don't like figurative sculpture anyway. So we're going to draw a line on this, you know, we'll never figure in sculpture again. But that's not quite true, but you know what I mean. But I think that non-written, non-written forms of commemoration are important.
I just wanted to say too that, see, way back, Dale Spender did work on Google, and it's like the dictionary. Who writes the dictionary? Who actually controls what's on Google? And Dr. Dale Spender's point was that Google was being compiled by men, and therefore if you go onto Google, the first things you'll find relate to men, they don't relate to women. And so it's this control, isn't it? It's the control over the publishing industry, it's the control over the newspaper industry, it's the control over who does the dictionary, who, you know, that maybe what the Australian Dictionary of Biography should do is make a determination that for the next 10 years, they will only do entries on women written by women, something like that. They have to make, because you've got to redress the years and years when women were overlooked as contributors and as subjects. Yeah. But thanks. Did you have something else to add?
No, I just want to thank you for asking me to come in today, and thank you for your time, and congratulations on the exceptional work that you're all doing. It's really important, and thank you.
Good, and thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right, we're now going to take an adjournment, and we'll come back at 1 o'clock.
No, which one?
Oh, well, it is 1 o'clock. I'm sorry.